behind the blue curtain. Here. Hello, welcome to some Derps Talk About Games. I'm your co-host, Mango.
And I am your co-host, Buddy.
And today we're going to talk a little bit about a thing called Indiefication. But before we do that, Buddy, why don't you tell the folks what it is we do on this podcast?
On this podcast, we like to talk about games, okay? And a couple of weeks ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, last week? No, it was 2 weeks ago. We did an episode on what I called roguelitification, right? And we did that whole episode. We talked about how games are picking up more and more sort of roguelike tendencies in their sort of core design ethos. And I sort of talked about how, in my head, I view this as a player mastery thing. Players are smarter, they are better, they have deeper ingrained understandings of design and systems, so they are able to handle more complex systems in a way that is I don't know, just like a next level apparatus on top of the way that they have been playing games originally. I likened this to games in the late 90s and early 2010s are very linear experiences, right? Point A to point B, right? Roguelikes are web-like 3D experiences, right? You're still going from point A to point B, but you are able to go to all these different other sorts of nodes, and mastery of the game and completion of the game is about an understanding of that web of sort of like nodes and probabilities and builds, all this other kind of stuff that is sort of like layered on top of, I guess, these sorts of like linear journeys. That was roguelitification. I also talked about Souls-likeification, which is like the worst word I've ever uttered in my fucking life, because I already don't really like the genre of Souls-like, and Indiefication. Today we're talking about Indiefication. In my view, these are the three pressures, these are the three forces that are kind of acting on games as a whole, as like a culture, as a market, as all this other stuff. And to me, Indiefication is really just like the summing up of what are the market forces doing to the games that we play, right? How are market pressures essentially defining these gaming kinds of experiences? And kind of my core thesis on this one is that AAA publishers rule scope, okay, and scale. That's not something indies can really compete on all that much. But in general, indies seem to be kind of, and I actually got a great, I said this before, but I got a great piece of evidence for this. Indies seem to be kind of out competing AAA by being cheaper, by being quicker to develop, by having fewer, kind of like knobs and levers to sort of pull on, and by, taking advantage, I guess I would say, of some of the ingrained advantages in the way that indie games sort of work. So what we're sort of seeing is what maybe I would have said 15 years ago is AAA forces are pressing indie games out of the market, right? At least like the Steam Greenlight era, right? Like it is hard for indie games to kind of like make their mark, because there's a lot of gatekeeping from platform holders. There's a lot of money for marketing. There's not a lot of access, not a lot of discoverability. Now we're in sort of the opposite position. I think AAA companies are getting pressured by indie companies because a lot of those rules have sort of flipped, and we can talk about some of the specifics of that stuff, I guess.
Yeah, no, I think I generally agree with pieces of that. I think, like to your point, it's a lot of this is based market pressures. I think you can even see that in like the wider market, right? There's a lot of new direct to consumer companies that are even kind of like growing outside of like say the Amazon ecosystem when it comes to e-commerce, right? Like every fucking ad you hear on every podcast, it's like buy, BetterHelp or like, semen vitamins or whatever, whatever podcaster is selling. That's all like companies that have chosen to advertise directly to consumers, instead of going through like more traditional media routes, and instead of like selling through a storefront, right? Like instead of going to Walmart and being like, Walmart, please put my vitamins up on the shelf, or you know, they will tell, you know, Joe Rogan or NPR. I guess NPR doesn't really take sponsorships, but like, you know, whatever another example of a popular podcast is, because I don't listen to popular podcasts, but like the Daily maybe. You know, they will say, you know, okay, we will give you some money for you to say to your listeners, buy this, right? And that's how we will get the word out, and then we won't have to pay the overhead of you know, Walmart taking a cut. We just have to pay like shipping costs, right? Which,
Yeah, that's actually one of the interesting things. I never knew this, but I eventually learned this about grocery stores, which I thought was pretty interesting, is that grocery stores don't really make their money selling you the groceries. They make their money selling the store space. They essentially sell the plot on the aisle,
right,
or they, like, I guess you'd maybe say rent the plot on the aisle to the bread manufacturer, and the bread manufacturer puts its bread on that aisle, and then they're the ones, and then they're making their money out of actually selling the bread. Really, the supermarket itself doesn't really care, and doesn't make all that much out of actually selling this or that. They make their money out of selling the space on the aisle to the you know, whoever, Lay's potato chips, right? Which is just a really fascinating way to think about. I don't think people conceive of the markets in those, you know, of like supermarkets in those ways.
yeah. And I'm sure that that varies by, like, you know, there are several mega brands, right? Like, I think there's like three giant grocery store chains, and then like there's usually like a regional local powerhouse, right? Like by me right now, it's or by where I am right now, it's Market Basket, which is like along the story, New England company. And like when we where we grew up, it was ShopRite, which is actually like a collective of like independent grocers that like share like warehousing. Um, but like, you know, like,
Really, I actually did not know that.
yeah, a collective is maybe the wrong term, but it's a cooperative, I think is the correct term. But like Star Market is owned by the same people who own Shaw's, is owned by, I think one of the big ones is Acme is owned by Albertsons, I think is like the top line brand name. But like Giant and Stop and Shop, I think are the same brand. But there's a couple of them. And like one of them owns a bunch of them, the other one owns the other ones. And then like there are other weird pieces, right? Like Whole Foods is owned by Amazon pretty famously. Um,
Yeah, Kroger is, I just looked at the local grocery store that's all over around here is Ralph's in Los Angeles, and Ralph's is owned by Kroger, I guess. And it's my understanding is that they are like the big one that owns most of these kinds of like chains, so that, like, you know, whatever the dominant local sort of name for grocery stores in your area is, right? A lot of the time it's going to be owned by Kroger or one of the other ones.
yeah. And you know, there's, you know, that's just kind of like, again, nature of kind of like market forces. But anyway, this is a little bit far afield of video game stuff. But what do you want to talk about? Like this is your topic. I'll let you.
Okay, yeah, this is my topic. So there's a couple of different component parts of this, and we can talk about them each in turn. Really, at the end of the day, I think the core thing is that flip that I described, right? Where it feels like indies are pressuring, you know, AAA in a way that didn't used to happen, basically. AAA was the name of the game in the mid 2000s, right? You know, like the Xbox 360 era would be a good kind of, this is when this is sort of like happening, because there's no good way to market indie games, right? There's no good avenue for an indie game to make it to a consumer. You have to go through platform holders, right? But the revolution that happened, which was kind of in the early 2010s, right? This is around Indie Game the movie. This is around Super Meat Boy, Fez, right? Like those are the ones that are mentioned in the movie itself. But also Braid is in here. Bastion would be in here, right? You know, any of these kinds of titles. These were the titles that were able, as in, you know, essentially indies, right, to kind of like crack through and prove to platform holders that there's a lot of value to sort of sourcing for this. So Steam did away with Steam Greenlight and opened up its platform, right? There's a whole piece of this that's mobile, right? That's on the mobile markets. And in fact, I would actually say that the true leader here is actually the Android, you know, like
Play
the
Store.
Android Apple App Store. Yes, exactly. Like kind of fight,
All right.
because the App Store.
I just kind of, because you said Android. I work for Google. I do not work on Android. My
Okay.
use, all that kind of standard stuff. But yes,
Yeah.
Android.
Because the App Store was pretty famously like actually locked down. It was very popular. Getting your app on the App Store was like a good thing, but like it was hard to make that happen. And then the Android sort of store kind of came up, which would eventually become the Google Play Store. And the Google Play Store, the Android marketplace was much more open.
Yes.
And the openness of the Android store caused Apple to open up its platform, right? Which caused tons of indie game development to happen in sort of the mobile space. And I think what happened was Steam essentially paired that with the success of these, kind of high profile indie games, a couple of whom had used its Steam Greenlight for sort of feature. And then they were like, you know what, I'm just going to open up my platform. And now we're sort of at this point where the floodgates have been opened. And now every day there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of uh, games getting released, most of which will never even see the light of day, right? And you are now at a piece where there are these indie games that are all over Steam and never even showing up on anybody's page because of I don't know, whatever, right? But that process to me is sort of the thing. This is the start of Indiefication. This is how it happens in its most nascent kind of era. Because what follows on for this is now you have a pathway for two kind of pieces. One of them is a business piece. I'm a developer. I've wanted to get into video games all my life. I love video games. I love StarCraft 2. I love, I don't know, Mass Effect. I love Halo 3, right? And I go to work at Bungie as a QA tester, and I eventually kind of end up as a mid-level developer. It's now 2012, right? I'm a mid-level developer. I've been making mid-level developer money for a couple of years, but I've been getting crunched. These games are tough, they're hard, or whatever.
I
And
will
so
also point out that you are making mid-level game developer money, which is much less than mid-level kind of like standard software developer money.
okay, yeah, true, fair, sure.
But this is to your point, right? Like
Yeah.
Go on.
And so you're feeling this sort of pressure, right? And then a friend of yours comes by and says, "Hey, I just heard that the Microsoft Indie Fund, right, is, if you make a pitch and you go and you say, hey, we're a couple of AAA developers. There's three of us. One of us is an artist. One of us is an engineer. The other is a designer. And we're going to make a game together. Microsoft will give me $250,000 to make us an indie game. They'll publish our indie game on like the platform. And so you quit your job. You make your indie game studio, right? You have kids coming out of school, right? I'm a kid. I grew up on, Mario and Crash Bandicoot and whatever. And I went to college to become, to a CS program somewhere, computer sciences program somewhere. Maybe even one of the kind of nascent game design sort of programs and like degrees, something at RIT, for instance. There's a million people from RIT in the industry. I'm constantly meeting them because they had, I don't want to say one of the first, but I don't know, one of the premier kind of like game programs for any college in the US when kind of like we were going to school. These folks are coming out of college and they're looking and they're hungry for work. They're looking for jobs. But like, what do you do when you are an unproven, developer who has game design, has this like wonky game design degree that nobody really like knows what to do with? Well, you go to work, you make your, you make your indie game, you put together your stuff, you put it on, you put it on Steam and you see how it goes, that kind of stuff. This is how I feel like this groundswell is happening. And we've already seen this happen before in history because it mirrors the exact same process that went on in the Hollywood era in the 1960s, where basically the collapse of the big budget studios, basically these huge budget studios like Fox or whatever, kind of like bet everything on individual like pictures that would end up kind of like bombing and like ruining the studio. And you had these guys who basically, went to people like Steven Spielberg, right? Martin Scorsese, this era of like directors, these like famous like kind of directors. These are kids who were coming up in film schools in that time and kind of like getting their I don't know, getting kind of like their boots on the ground, right? George Lucas would actually be another really fantastic example. He went to USC. We've seen this process happen before. It's repeating again right now in games, and the effects of it are kind of all around us, right? Even when I started in indie games, which was 5 years ago, right? Like that's when I left AAA to start working in indie games, there was an order of magnitude fewer games coming out on Steam year by year, compared to now, which I think is interesting, and it's crazy, and all of this stuff is affecting how games are, um, from sort of the bottom up rather than from the top down. That's my whole thesis. That's my
Yeah,
whole theory in a long form.
I think you're like mostly correct. I would quibble maybe a little bit around the edges or like add some more context. One like heard you say this a couple times that like placing Greenlight as like kind of like a thing that needed to be defeated in order for this to happen. I think you actually place it as like Greenlight is the start of this happening, right? Like part of like indie games have existed pre Greenlight, pre Steam even, but they were kind of like files that you found on a website and always had like a level of sketchiness. This is like Dwarf Fortress
Yep.
and like NetHack and Rogue, right? Things that like people don't like, people like normies, for lack of a better term, wouldn't touch it. They're like, that's a file on the internet, and all of our like good internet hygiene taught to us by like the paranoia of the 90s is like you don't download those files, right? Some of that still exists today in kind of like games that you install via like Linux package installers, for the purists that are like still won't like run Steam or whatever. But I think Greenlight is the first opportunity for a lot of these people to put their thing on a trusted platform, right? Even though, and to your point, even though Android and iOS are like more open, these are still like relatively trusted platforms, right? Like part of this is that like they are new enough systems that like writing malware for phones is like not quite a thing yet. And even if you are running malware, it's usually kind of like harmless stuff that's like mean but like not like ruinous, right? This is also before like a lot of like the environment is sandboxed enough or like isolated enough that like even if you write a malicious app, maybe it crashes your phone, it's pretty hard for it to like steal your banking information. And so there's like more receptiveness on the consumer's part. To your point, Greenlight transferring to a much more open system is a big part of this. I think to your point, like people who part of the issue with game developer stuff, this is part of my thing about like game developers don't get paid a ton, is that there have always been a lot of more people that want to develop games than there are slots at like established companies, right?
Yeah.
This is the thing that I went through personally, right? Like I chose the route of going into normal industry rather than trying to do an indie game. But to your point, like this is also part of what pushes it, right? Is there a bunch of people with specialized degrees that maybe have a little bit of a tougher time going into industry, or enough let's say like existing capital. What I'm saying here is like rich parents, right? Or like the kind of our kind of generational thing where like you live at home for longer than the previous generation did, which maybe isn't necessarily rich, but essentially you're not paying rent, and so you can afford to sink your time into a game, which is a productive endeavor. But so the problem.
This is the story of Stardew Valley, right? That guy basically lived off of his girlfriend for 5 years, right? Developing Stardew Valley, and then actually Concerned Ape, right, is the developer, and then actually the game came out and made a gazillion dollars, right? But if you think about it, right, the amount of upfront cost that was,
right.
and he did that all on his own. He solo developed that game, right? The amount of upfront cost associated with that is just like it's pretty high, pretty astronomical.
Yeah. That is like the problem, right? Is like a lot of, even with like early stage internet startups, right? You can quickly get to an MVP and maybe start getting getting some revenue there. Obviously, also the kind of like investment capital is better in kind of startup land than it is in game land, because like games can take off, but they're not traditionally like invested in by venture capital in the same way that
Yeah, it's because they have publishers.
Yeah,
If you're an indie game studio, you're typically not looking for investment in your studio, right? Which is the company, right?
really.
You are looking for investment in the project, and you go to a publisher for that, and the publisher gets a percentage of your project, right?
Yeah,
So it's just like it's a whole different kind of structure.
It's a different model, but I also think that just kind of like games as a product don't meet the same kind of like they don't have the same like a successful game will make a lot of money, but they don't spawn like a successful company in the same way from like an investor standpoint.
Yeah.
And then I think the other part that you didn't mention, I think is like actually probably the most crucial, is uh, I would say Unity specifically, but more broadly, kind of like the availability of out of the box engines that let people build things without having to build a lot of the underlying technology, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even RPG Maker, right? Like I believe Undertale's an RPG Maker game, if I'm not mistaken.
Game Maker is another one, right?
Yeah,
Game Maker 2 is like the a platform. Well, I've published Game Maker 2 games. Obviously, most of the games that I published are Unity games, and so like our preferred one, right? But then at that point, you're starting to get like specialized people, right?
yeah.
This is one of the things that changes about hiring inside of the game industry that I feel like not a lot of people have a good understanding of. Once engines began to get standardized, right? Because you had engines obviously in like the before times, right? You had Source, right? You still had Unreal, obviously the very early kind of iterations of Unreal, but most of the time AAA game development was happening with proprietary engines, right? That these developers were making. StarCraft 2 was developed on whatever that engine is called, I don't even know. And then Heroes of the Storm, another Blizzard game, was also developed on that engine, right? Um and this was the model. Basically, the company would make the engine and they would make a couple of games out of that engine. Sort of like Frostbite would be another good example, right?
Right.
EA had DICE make Frostbite. They made a couple of games. They handed it off to BioWare. BioWare made a couple of games out of Frostbite, that kind of
or
but what
or
ended up
like
happening.
what's it called? Bethesda make the creation engine, make games until the end of time, never
Yeah,
updating.
they
Yeah.
will never stop. What is the Paradox engine called?
Um.
Like
Clash
Scrivener or something?
Fits. Clash
Oh,
Fits.
Clash Fits. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Exactly. It's like all of that stuff, right? This is kind of the way things kind of like traditionally worked. But now most people just take Unreal. Most people just do Unity and Unreal, right? Like these are
Yeah.
the engines that define almost all of games outside of things like Paradox, who have this engine that does this very specific niche thing that they like want to do, right? Because you have some games, right? Unreal is built for 3D. Unity is pretty open, can be built for a lot of different things. And there's other sorts of, there's other engines that have other strengths. Proton, for instance, is an engine that lets you make a multiplayer backend sort of in your engine, which is really, really useful because that's
Yeah.
like a highly specialized kind of like piece of the work.
Godot is another one, which is like kind of the big
Yeah.
one that a lot of people went to after the Unity fiasco a couple months
Yeah.
ago. Um.
Um, and I think the interesting thing kind of underwriting a lot of this sort of stuff is that suddenly you're not just hiring talented smart developers who probably know like compute programming languages, right? But they don't, you train them up on your engine, right? If I go to work on World of Warcraft, right? World of Warcraft has an engine that I don't remember the name. I think it's literally called like WoW Edit or something like that, right? um I could be a developer on Fortnite and I go to work at Blizzard on World of Warcraft and they train me up on their engine, right? I take my expertise and I just I figure it out. And I go, how do I write this thing, in this like whatever scripting language, that kind of stuff. Um it feels like now, especially in hiring, you get Unreal developers where it's like, okay, I'm looking for an Unreal developer. I'm looking for a senior Unreal developer. I'm looking for a senior Unity developer, right? These are folks who have a specialization in an engine itself and can work on that engine for you for whatever purpose, right? Which has sort of changed the way it's almost kind of like it's almost kind of like saying, you know, I'm only hiring this kind of programmer, right? Like a programmer that programs in Python or C or something like that,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. Um, which I don't know if is that like that's not happening. You do front end, back end, obviously, but
So it depends. The kind of general wisdom is that you know companies that hire to specific languages or frameworks are not smart to do that, right? There's a little bit around kind of like experience around kind of like functional versus object oriented programming because functional was relatively new, a couple, or not new, but relatively new in commercial applications a few years ago, and it's just kind of like a different way of thinking about programs, but like. Yes, people will look for certain skill sets, but most of the time, it's generally thought that like a good programmer's a good programmer. But to your point, right? Like the web ecosystem is a set of technologies, right? And being a web developer is a thing. It just happens to be that like 90% of like most programming jobs are some flavor of web developer, right?
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
but to your point, essentially, it's not just that you're um, that you're hiring to a specialization. You're basically cutting your dev staff in half at a certain level, right? Like part of this is that like if you go and work for one of these big companies with their own homespun engine, there's generally two classes of developers, right? There's the it's called like the application level developers that are building things in the engine, and then there's the engine developers that are building the engine itself, right? And they're generally pretty well separated. On a smaller game, a smaller game with that not working an engine, those are generally the same people, but that's just kind of like a resourcing thing. But like, right now, the engine developers for a lot of games are employed by Unity and they work for Unity and Unity pays them, right? Like, and it's essentially like, it's application developers that are building the games on top of that, and that's like a significant reduction in the amount of staff you need in order to like bring something to fruition, because you don't need somebody who can like either write a physics engine from scratch or like knows OpenGL, right, and has to like render shapes on screen, right? Like usually there's a level of abstraction that's already built in between there.
Yeah, this is kind of like how there are I want to say every time there's like a WoW expansion, right? You have these big kind of titanic systems level upgrades that are happening. This is because there are essentially engineers working in the back end of the game to deliver on that. So a for good example for this expansion, man, I can't actually think of too many changes they made. A good example for Shadowlands would be, or I guess technically this happened in Battle for Azeroth, would be changing the way the auction house worked, right? That wasn't a designer. It's not like a game designer went in there and like changed the functionality of the auction house window in World of Warcraft, right? That's an engineer who was essentially live editing the engine on which WoW was built in order to create the new auction house instead of the old auction house, kind of like. And it's funny because these I know some of these people and they describe their jobs in very dramatic terms. It's like upgrading an airplane mid-flight, right? It's like trying to switch over from propeller engines to jet engines in the middle of a flight, kind of thing, because they obviously have all these sorts of whatever kinds of I don't even know what I would call it. They just have like a lot of things drawing on them, I guess. And the needs that they have for their attention and time, that kind of stuff. And you also are editing a live game that, like, if you push essentially bad edits, right, you could end up completely borking absolutely everything, right? Which was one of the weird things about stuff like WoW. We talk about like there are 4 bag slots or something that you get, and it's because of the way the auction house was coded into the bag system or like the inventory system or whatever. It's like all of those kinds of like artifacts, all of those kinds of artifacts. Anyway,
This is like the Timos thing in Riot in League of Legends, which is apparently a real thing. Like I read
yeah,
a story by a Riot dev about how like you can't like when they were designing Jinx, her like mines were supposed to like light the bush on fire initially, and they didn't have a good way of telling if like where the bushes were, but you could tell if a hero was in a bush. So the dev was like, yeah, so I spawned a bunch of Timos, and if it hit the Timo that was in the bush, we could light the bush on fire, right? Which is like, that's just kind of like an artifact of like the initial design decisions that like weren't necessarily the most future proof, and like taking player knows battlegrounds, right? When we were at the height of that, when we were playing a bunch of it, they were like, we're going to take a quarter and not do any new features and just improve performance. And they abandoned that after like 2 weeks because everybody hated it. Everybody's like, where are my new features, right? Like, but yes. Anyway, continue.
Yeah, and it's also sort of like the bunnies, the invisible bunnies that describe everything in World of Warcraft, because how the designers essentially found that the easiest thing to do most of the stuff that they were looking to do was to spawn an invisible NPC, and the top NPC on the menu was was bunny, right? It was like a underscore bunny or
Mm.
something. There's a Kotaku article. This is famous from a couple of years ago. That kind of stuff. Anyway, um as this stuff gets standardized, as this stuff kind of gets like baked in, I think, to sort of the industry, and we have this sort of thing where you're no longer hiring, or it's not that you're hiring talented developers and then training them up in your engine, right? You're actually looking for developers who have some sort of specialization in an engine. They worked on the engine from one project to another, moving to another, all of this other kind of stuff. Now you have this ability to kind of cross pollinate pretty easily, right? Somebody who understands working in Unreal because they worked in AAA can then go and buy their own Unreal license and just start making their indie game in Unreal, right? This is the story of dozens and dozens of indie games that I like know, some of which I've worked on, right? It's just like, yes, I was a developer on Borderlands, and I made Borderlands, 1, 2, 3, and the pre-sequel and all of the other spin-off, whatever stupid Borderlands titles, and I just got really, really good at the Unreal Engine, and I wanted to make it in that kind of thing. The other thing is,
I actually I do want to say that part of that too is not just buy your own Unreal license, but like many of the engines now have a scheme where you don't pay until you make money, right? They will grant you the license with the understanding that if your project is successful, they will then take a piece of your revenue, which like lowers the barrier to entry immensely, right?
yeah,
Like, anyway,
yeah, I mean, we get our the way the licenses work is also very complicated, because you can get licenses from other people. Like you can, I don't know. I'm not going to get into that. Whatever, it doesn't matter.
wait,
But
wait,
the point is that this allows for a ton of cross pollination,
sure.
right? And you no longer are sort of siloing developers off. A real thing that used to happen is I would go to work at EA, I would become an expert in the Frostbite engine, right? And now all of a sudden I'm kind of locked to EA. Not truly, obviously anybody can go get a new job, but the barrier to entry is much higher, because now I have to prove that, well, I have all this experience in an engine you don't have access to. Let me, come and get new experience on your proprietary engine. Now this stuff is transferable inside and outside of a company.
I,
At the same time, there's
I
a lot of
actually, sorry, just real
oh,
quick.
sure.
I want to point out that like something you pointed out there that I didn't even think about that's very important is it's not like if you want to go from like Unreal to Unity, right? Like there are people that one know both, and two, you have if you can go evaluate what Unreal skills look like from the outside, right? Like you said, people outside of EA can't access Frostbite, right? And so if you want someone to vouch for kind of like the skills inherent in that, you need somebody else who also came from EA that could have spoken to Frostbite as an engine. Even if you don't have the exact skill match, right? Unreal being not open source, but like open to everybody to use means that that skill is more transferable by its nature, because it's evaluatable outside of the context of even using it.
Yeah, that's actually like super true, right? So we're breaking down these barriers to developers being able to sort of like leave the AAA kind of space. The one other piece of this that I just want to mention, because it's kind of happening at the same time of all this other sort of stuff I'm describing, and I do think it matters, but not in a like a super measurable sense, is web games and Flash.
Ooh,
I actually think that the real sort of version of all of this is Flash and like Shockwave and like Flash
yeah,
games, right? The truest open platform that used to exist was like E-Bombs World or Newgrounds,
grounds,
right?
right? Like,
Yeah, yeah, or like the Cartoon Network, right? Like the Cartoon Network website used to have all of those Flash games. I used to play constantly on those sorts of spaces. I don't think I don't think that has as titanic an influence, but it does sort of like matter to kind of like some of this. And I would probably point to that as some of as like a lot of the first indie game developers were people who made a ton of Flash games, right?
right, yeah, absolutely.
Which I think is really interesting. And part of that is also developers become public and get clout at a certain point kind of in this era. There are always developers who were, kind of at the, at the apex of the sort of industry and had that level of name recognition. There's that one quote that's incredibly funny with the creator of Deus Ex, who would even hate me as describing him that way. I can't remember his name off. Is it Warren Spector?
I think that's right.
There's a quote that says, where he says, there's this misunderstanding in the industry that games are created by one person, and the quote is, says Warren Spector, creator of Deus Ex. And so you have Will Wright, you have Hideo Kojima would be a good example. Obviously Shigeru Miyamoto. You have Warren Spector, Sid Meier, a couple of these just like high level names. People recognize these names.
Tom
we understand.
Clancy.
Yeah. I was about to agree with you for a second. But I think something that happened was that process also got democratized, right? And part of this is just because of the nature of the internet, right? The reason that these folks were kind of rising to the occasion in the 90s is because your news related to video games came in magazines, right? And a magazine can set up a feature on some guy, on Cliff Bleszinski, right? Much more, like is required to make that sort of happen. But as you get into the mid 2000s, as you kind of get into the era of Facebook and Twitter, now all of a sudden you have game developers that are just interacting with players like day to day, right? Like, the barrier between me getting information about sort of the inner workings of my company to a developer is like lower and lower, right? And you start getting
better
these,
or for worse.
yeah, true. Yeah, absolutely.
Phil
And you start
Fish,
getting
right?
these rock stars, right?
Yeah.
We were talking before the podcast in sort of behind the blue curtain about Blizzard had this reputation, right? And the reason why is because Blizzard had forums, and the forums had game developers who had they had blue highlights to their names or whatever, and they had some, they had names that were like Ghostcrawler would be an example, right? Ghostcrawler was the you know um lead designer on World of Warcraft for a long time. He was responding to forum threads. He had direct access to people, which allowed him to create kind of clout, right? It allowed him to sort of create a cult of personality. And I think that happened with a lot of different developers, and many of them were able to translate that cult of personality outside of the AAA space and into the indie space. A good example of that that's going on right now, they just put up the demo on Steam for Steam Next Fest, would be Stormgate. The Stormgate developers are ex Blizzard StarCraft 2 developers who basically said, hey, Blizzard doesn't want to make an RTS. We still love this genre and we want to still make a game for it. And that game is now Stormgate. They got a bunch of like, VC funding for it and everything like that. This is people following the story of these developers, right? This is Chris Metzen quits World of Warcraft and decides to make a custom D&D setting, I think called Ouroboros is what it's called or whatever, right? And obviously, whatever, he went back to Blizzard, but we won't talk about that. It's like this process also helps and bolsters kind of the sense of Indiefication.
I actually do want to
like,
no, it's fine. I think for a second I also want to talk about the flip side of that, which is like, we're talking about Stormgate, which I guess RTS we know has an audience, but like part of this too is that the expansion of like video games is a thing that normal people do instead of just a nerd thing, right? Like, we're still playing video games, right? Like, I think our parents maybe expected us to grow out of it at some point, right? But like, I don't think a lot of people did, right? Like even still, like normal adults that aren't enthusiasts play like Madden, right? Like, or Call of Duty, right? And I think that part of that means that like before the entire industry was an enthusiast industry, right? Like everybody who played was kind of like somebody who was into it. Now, there's another level where like most people who engage with it are not enthusiasts, but the people that are enthusiasts are willing to pay. One, we're older, we've grown, we've got disposable income, and two, we have particular desires for things that are less approachable but more tuned to our specific desires, and so there's a market opportunity for people to develop those things, right? Like with a lot of indie games, some of that's like more story rich content, some of that's more kind of themed content, maybe more political content is a way to put it too. More stuff with a message that's not kind of like pablum. Again, for better or for worse. And then on top of that, also a desire for games that are more difficult, which maybe rolls into the Souls-likefication thing we'll talk about at some other point. Or kind of that is more specialized that, like, you know, normal people wouldn't want to approach, right? Like the amount of time it took me to get into Crusader Kings 2 was kind of inordinate, right? But like that's
Yeah, we call that overhead, right?
yeah. But like I was willing to do it. There were enough people out there to support it, so they didn't require people like me, who was like a mid-level fan, to like bounce off of it 3 times before they got it, right? And now Paradox is like verging on AAA, I guess is the way to put it, right? Like, because there is enough enthusiast audience to kind of like propel these specialized projects forward. I think that's an important part of this too.
No,
Right?
I absolutely agree with that, and I think it propels a lot. One of the biggest benefits to the games industry is attention, right? People just care. Actually, to come at this from another angle, a long time ago, we were talking about the sexual harassment allegations that were coming at like down as part of Blizzard, right? And I made this point when I was talking about that, where I said nobody cares if the person who works in a bread factory, right, a bread bakery, the person I think at the time I said the person who slices your bread is a pedophile. Nobody cares about that, and it's not because they don't care about pedophiles; it's because they don't care about bread, right? Nobody pays attention to the inner workings of the companies that make bread. Nobody pays attention to the makeup. There are no superstar bread like people on Twitter with thousands of followers just because they announced, "Hey, I'm starting on Monday at the bakery," right? You know what I mean? When you work in games, you are automatically highlighted. You have this extra sense of influence and clout just because that's what comes with working in an industry that people dedicate essentially their lives to in some cases, right? You have people whose entire life is sort of built around honestly, I'm talking about myself in a way, but how many of my friends are friends through the conduit of World of Warcraft, through my like World of Warcraft subscription, right? How many people have friends who are like that, but for any number of other sorts of games that form the basis of their social scene? League of Legends, Destiny, right? You could it's so easy to fill out that list.
Yeah, I
And
mean
that
the
creates
the
that.
industry has entire sub industries that like games journalism, for all its faults, right, is like at some levels real journalism that's independent. It's not like most industries have like trade magazines, right?
Yeah.
Which are essentially like advanced marketing materials for enthusiasts, and they have their place. And games journalism has a healthy dose of that. That's kind of, but that's maybe not great. But the fact that we even consider that maybe a problem is like an explanation of just like how big it is, right? Like in any other industry, no one would care about ethics in like, kitchen equipment journalism, right? Because it's expected that all it is like industry puffery, right? Like,
Yeah.
the idea that games journalism maybe has a purpose beyond just being puff pieces for the industry is a thing that is unique to these kinds of industries, right?
Yeah, there was a while. Did you know I used to be really into cars when I was a kid?
I did not.
This all came because I had a subscription to a magazine. I can't remember what it was called. It's like whatever the big auto like magazine was, right? And I was reading article after article about these like insane specs on cars I would never be able to afford. Right? Like, what is the new Ford supercar, the Ford GT 500, right? What's that engine like? What kind of transmission does it have or whatever? And I got really wrapped up in that stuff. I mean, I was like 13. I thought cars were neat. You know what I mean? Like in the same way that like when I was 8, I thought trains were neat or stegosauruses were neat, right? That kind of stuff. The that underwrites, I guess is what I would say. So much of how we approach how we approach games, right? Just this raw attention that people give it is wholly and totally unique. One of the things that we've been talking about kind of like in the industry over the past couple of weeks, honestly, the past couple of months at this point, is the number of layoffs that have been happening in the games industry, which is a truly gargantuan number, right? I think at this point, the number is easily like 10 or 20,000 sort of game developers from basically every AAA publisher had a round of layoffs, and most folks kind of recognize this as a sort of like a miniature bubble burst, where during the COVID years there was a huge extra surge of investor interest in video games as kind of a space and as kind of a market. But as interest rates went up and inflation, all this other sort of stuff, a lot of those investors got kind of spooked and pulled their money out. And now there's a belt tightening kind of like happening in sort of the video game space. If you were to go on Twitter or Facebook, right? Um, and you were to see the way that people talk about these layoffs, right?
Battery
Like, what is the
low.
coverage of these layoffs like in a Reddit thread about them, right? It is vitriol and anger, and there is this like level of kind of personal sort of like betrayal
Right.
almost in some instances that kind of comes to it. And this isn't to say that, yes, I think layoffs suck. I think that this state of the industry, even as I think video games are in a really good spot, like me personally, as a kind of
Charging
analyzing the
battery.
market and all this stuff, I've made that claim a number of different times. And Indiefication, I think, is a good force on the market. It is also a force that does this, right, which is very bad. But the reason that people care about this, right, no, if somebody gets laid off from the bread factory, who cares?
Yeah.
Nobody's gonna there's no article that goes up. There's no tweet that goes viral talking about the injustice of it. There's no, it's completely wild and unheard of, and it operates by a completely different set of rules. But one of the things that does do is support indie game developers, because there's so much attention and people are personality driven and they want to kind of find and latch on to authentic personalities in this space. You can parlay your experience, you can parlay that kind of social capital into indie games, into making indie games, right? Tim Rogers did this famously, right? Before he eventually would kind of pack it up to become a journalist, right? But they made, I mean, I don't know, I guess maybe Truckheck is actually coming out at some point. Do you know about that? I mean, like,
I don't know. Like, yeah. Anyway, go.
they made their other game. It's the point, right?
Yeah.
He was in AAA. He got this kind of cult of personality. He made his indie game, with Action Button or whatever, and then now he's like kind of going back into this journal at this point. I don't even know, but whatever. He's just like a sort of a poster child for this. And now what happens is, the 20,000 people who got laid off or whatever, these people can go make indie game studios. And the end point that we are beginning to reach is kind of best exemplified by Prince of Persia. Do you know this Prince of Persia game?
I've heard of it. I know he has like the was it the Killmonger hair is what people are calling it.
The Prince of Persia game that came out, I think it's Prince of Persia like something. I don't know. It's got like some subtitle like The Lost Crown or something like that. I misread this game personally, to be honest with you. This is like industry scuttlebutt. The Prince of Persia game set an announce or a launch date for January 18th, right? January 18th, 2024. This was in June of last year, and I was looking to place Grime on the calendar. I knew that we were launching the final DLC and the Switch port for Grime, and I put Grime in January. And basically it was like the same day, right? I was looking, I actually did it a week after. Grime came out on the 25th, instead of the 18th. And I looked at the and I looked at Prince of Persia, and I was kind of like, I don't think this is going to sell, right? I don't think this is going to really like appeal to people all that much. It's a 2D platforming Metroidvania. This is my thought process. I was like, it's a 2D platforming Metroidvania. Okay. It is a $60 game that people are used to paying $20 for. Grime is $20, right? Most, like Blasphemous is $20, right? Hollow Knight is $20. Like these are the games that they're kind of thinking. This is a space that has just been scooped by indies. You're not going to be able to make this work. I was sort of wrong on one end, because it looks great. Prince of Persia looks great. People really love Prince of Persia. It has high kind of traction in the Metroidvania spaces. People are really enjoying it. It has really high scores from critics and everything like that. But I was right that the market didn't respond to that. Prince of Persia apparently only sold about 300,000 copies, which is a failure by Ubisoft's standards, right? Because even at that $60 price point, $70 price point, I actually think, um, it just wasn't able to sort of make the AAA money back. When it's like, boy, I would go wild if I could sell something, like if I could sell an experience like that for 300,000 dollars. Even if when I'm selling an indie game, I'm gonna sell it for 15 or 20 bucks kind of thing, right? To me, this is where Indiefication sort of takes up. The only way that AAA can compete is in scale because indies are so good at the base stuff and they can deliver on that at a cheaper price point typically, right? You don't need a $60, you don't need to attach a $60 price point to an indie game. You attach a $25 price point to an indie game kind of thing. Like Pal World, I think, is $25. This is the other thing that launched on January 18th, and honestly also sort of scooped, like Prince of Persia, though there's the counter program. And that's just like, to me, this is the microcosm of Indiefication in action. Prince of Persia launches, sells 300K, and unfortunately that's just like not enough to cut it in the modern 2024 games market. And I think that's probably true for a number of other genres, right? I don't think that, you know it's not like we're going to see, I don't know, what's like a genre that's only indies at this point.
Uh,
Platformers. The
yeah,
only platformer left is Mario, right?
and some
There's
other
no.
Nintendo games, but yeah,
Yeah,
like
exactly,
Kirby,
right?
right?
Yeah, sure. This used to be the genre that dominated all gaming, right? This is in like the 8 and 16-bit era, right? All of these games are sort of platformers. But now, you can make Super Mario, the Super Mario like Wonder kind of, versions of games, and then Pizza Tower essentially, right? And honestly, platformers are so saturated that most indie game publishers aren't signing them because like there's just so many indie game platform. Everybody wants to make a platformer apparently, that kind of thing, right? Um and I think the places where AAA is competing and will compete is on stuff like Starfield, right? Or like Horizon Zero Dawn. These open world games, right? Open worlds are really big and expensive. GTA 6, right? Like this is the stuff that like a AAA game can kind of like muster. There's a little bit in here that's also about multiplayer, right? But honestly, even that is getting sort of low key scooped by indies, right? Lethal Company and you know, oh God, what the fuck is that? Deep Rock Galactic,
Oh yeah,
right? Are beating out titles like Back for Blood, which is a Warner Brothers title, right? Redfall, which is a Microsoft title, that are in the same sort of genres. Um,
yeah.
so yeah,
I think the thing there is that like anything that is highly competitive and requires like good infrastructure to run is still going to be in the AAA space, right? Like, and by highly competitive, like where like the actions have to be against each other, right? Like the reason that like I'm gonna what will I will call them? I'll call them bro shooters are still mostly AAA is one, normies aren't as into the kind of indie market, right? And two, in order for these games to work at a level that doesn't feel terrible, you need a level of money behind it, right? The closest thing that ever came to it was Player Unknown's Battlegrounds, and even that had its like that got surpassed by like Fortnite and Apex Legends at some level, right? Like at the offerings from the big companies.
so the funny thing is that that's actually a good example of what I'm talking about when I talk about the flip, right? Where indies drive AAA.
Right.
Fortnite is essentially an indie game that gets aped by all of these AAA games, right? And expands kind of like up and out, I guess. Is I don't know. I think that is like an interesting I don't know. I guess I a phenomenon. I don't even know what I would call it,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, but that's also kind of like, I mean, part of that is standard kind of like, it's like less unique to video games, more kind of like smaller, more nimble companies can take risks, and
Yeah.
then the bigger companies that are more established can like follow trends. Um, in a way that they can throw like a money and resources behind, um, and like and once it's like proven to be like a thing, can be more willing to do, right? Like the problem with a battle royale style game is maybe not like what I'm not maybe not anybody ever thought of it, but also like doing a new thing for a big company is sometimes a risk that they don't want to take, right? And then Arma 3 and then PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds proved the model. And it's like, well, we could do that without it looking like an asset flip, which PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, I don't know if that's totally fair to it, but it looks like an asset flip if it isn't, type of deal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's my like big thesis. That's my like big kind of pitch for
Yeah.
this stuff.
So
I actually think that the well of indie games is now so great that it's almost creating a new, you might say we have AAA games. People said quadruple A. Do you remember
yeah,
this? Like
quadruple A was like what was like the like maybe Call of Duty, right? Like the very GTA, the very big titles, right? But
yeah, to me, I think of Diablo 4 as a quadruple A title. 9 years of development with 5,000 developers over that time, and then that thing made like $4 billion or something, like billion, like billion with a B dollars, right? That to me is like a quadruple A kind of game. Whereas something like, I don't even know. It just feels like there are a lot of like other sort of stuff that are coming out that are a little closer to the ground in terms of sort of like scope and expectation, maybe. Total War Warhammer 3 would maybe be a good triple A game. This is a
right,
straightforward kind of triple A game,
yeah,
right?
yeah. My
And then
instinct was to maybe call it double A, but that's like also not quite right. I think you're right. It's
yeah. I mean, technically, like it's Sega, but it's also I don't know. I also think that like strategy games are just like a really different space in general, right?
yeah,
It's funny to me that strategy games have kind of become and adopted this games as a service model. I am flirting at the edges with like me and Hearts of Iron 4 are staring at each other across the room, kind of like giving each other eyes. And I'm like, maybe I'll play a little Hearts of Iron 4 again, right? But like Hearts of Iron 4 has so much DLC at this point that Paradox has bundled it all into a subscription. So you can pay $5 a month to get access to all of the DLC content. And I was like, oh my God, they're like reinventing the subscription model. And apparently they've done that for a bunch of the other titles because there's just like so much DLC that has come out over like the years and years and years. And anyway, I just think all of that is like kind of interesting.
yeah. I mean, part of that is that like the draw of like a Paradox game and the other grand strategy games is like you play it. It is effectively a live service game without a live service component, right? Like, essentially a game that you can play endlessly, and so like throwing more knobs to turn to make your gameplay a little bit more unique.
Yeah, like people were they just announced for Hearts of Iron 4. They just announced a Brazil, I can't remember what it's called. Something like allegiance to like test of allegiance or something like that. It's a Brazil, Chile, and Argentina DLC pack for Hearts of Iron 4, which is obviously World War II. And like the big selling point is that they made national focus trees for those three nations, right? And one of the interesting things about Paradox games in general is that Paradox games have asymmetrical difficulty that is built on country, right? If I start my game in Hearts of Iron 4 playing the United States, that's functionally easy mode. The
Right.
United States is so transcendently powerful just by the nature of kind of the historical position, the US was kind of
Yeah,
like in.
for the same reasons that the United States helped win World War II, right? Like the United
Yeah,
States is powerful in the
but
game.
also Nazi Germany is the same sort of thing, right? And there are challenges, right? It's not like it's easy, right? But like when you're a giga advanced Hearts of Iron 4 player, you are playing hard mode Algeria. You build no planes and you have to conquer the world. It's like, who the fuck does that? How do you do that? And the answer is you have this insane mastery of systems that like are just like endlessly buck wild, and you're just like taking so much advantage of cheese in the same way that like a high-end player of Mythic Plus in World of Warcraft is taking advantage of cheese. Like standing on an object in order to, trick the boss into spawning a pool on the ground that you are standing in, but because you're on the object, you're above the pool and you're not taking damage. Stuff like that, right? Like when you would otherwise get to a key level that damage would one shot you, you're now standing on objects, who I hope you have fun up there kind of thing. It's like people are doing essentially that for Hearts of Iron 4 and then making YouTube videos about it and getting 250,000 views. And it's just like wild to me that this whole ecosystem exists, and it kind of exists a little bit outside of the frame of like Indiefication that I'm talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that all makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, I think it's nothing but a good thing, right? Like,
Yeah.
Right.
I think that, when people talk about to use that Hollywood example, when people talk about that era in the late 60s and early 70s, um it's one of the like golden eras of Hollywood filmmaking, right? It's one of those eras where people, film classes are just all about this era of movies, and so many classic, sort of movies are coming out right then, and you have these really great interesting stories right then before kind of the industry changed kind of all over again, which ended up happening kind of with Star Wars, the birth of the blockbuster, right? You have Jaws, you have Star Wars that are happening in the late 70s and kind of bridge into a very different 80s for movie making. So
I
yeah,
mean, hell,
I don't know.
there's
Here we
even an
are.
aspect of that like translates to like YouTube, right? Like, which kind of gets you more like independent creators that can kind of do what they want with like cheap consumer grade stuff and still be incredibly popular and incredibly profitable,
Yeah.
right? Like, but yeah, I think I generally agree with you. Yeah.
Okay. Hell yeah. Well, that's it.
We've talked for an hour. Yeah. How's your week been? What you been playing?
A lot of World of Warcraft. We've been pushing keys in World of Warcraft. The thing. So I am now 33054, I think is my Raider IO rating. Which is just means that I've pushed 22s and everything on Tyrannical, and I'm going to end up pushing a bunch of keys on Fortified kind of next week. We're going to kind of see how hard I can go, how high I can climb, which is pretty interesting. Because I got the legendary axe. Do you know about that? Did I talk about this?
No, you didn't. Go for it.
Yeah, I got the legendary axe in WoW, and frankly, it's the greatest. And all the haters are lame, and I don't know. That axe is great. It's super fun. I have a complicated relationship with a lot of sort of like WoW kind of like item design. I have a lot of like complicated thoughts about some of this sort of stuff. There are sometimes items that feel like legendary, right? The gavel, the gavel of the jailer is a good example of this. Called Gavel of the First Arbiter. It's actually probably my favorite designed item in the entire game. It was a really powerful two-hander, drops off the jailer, has a unique, kind of like piece of art, and it had this on-use effect that I think had a 4-minute cooldown, but it spawned a soul, and then you attacked the soul, and you got a buff for a minute, right? And the buff had a different effect depending on which realm you judged the soul to go to, because the idea is this is the jailer's hammer, he was the original arbiter, and he's sending souls to places. So you spot a soul, you judge the soul. If you send it to Revendreth, you put a bleed on the target that siphons health, right? If you put the soul to Ardenweald, every attack does like a little burst of AoE damage, right? If you send the soul to Maldraxxus, it puts a stacking single target dot on the target. You can't control where it goes; it just goes where it goes and does what it does. Insanely powerful weapon, best in slot for like everybody. Incredibly cool effect. I really loved the Gavel of the First Arbiter, but it was epic. It was not legendary, right? Which is interesting. And kind of unique. What like differentiates a legendary weapon versus sort of versus an epic one? And I don't know, maybe the answer is just like rarity, whatever. Fearlath is a super rare. Most of our friends, we've been killing Farak every week, and a lot of them don't have Fearlath. I know me and one other person I know have Fearlath, and that's it. And that's out of all of my 20 plus two wielding strength contacts who have been playing WoW since the kind of the beginning of season 3. But Fearlath is really strong. It's really fun. It makes me do dumb shit, which is pretty great. There was a whole quest line to craft it, which took maybe 250,000 gold, but I had 17, so who cares, kind of thing. And now we're using it to push high keys and really like crush some of these, crush some of these keys. So yeah, that's it. That's where I'm at.
Nice, very cool. A little sad that I feel like monks at least haven't gotten a super cool weapon in a while. Like I enjoyed the Valkyrie spear from last expansion, but that even wasn't like a high tier weapon. They're just like a fun thing with a fun effect.
Yeah.
But
there's a good one this year, right? The fist. Doesn't Urktos's fist have a cantrip?
I don't think it has a kit. I hope it doesn't. Otherwise, I've been leaving damage on the floor.
Hold on. Where's the? Let's see. Monk best in slot. Because I'm pretty sure it is. And Farak has a cantrip weapon, the cantrip polearm. Rashan the Immortal Blaze.
Oh yes, no, I have one of those, but it is not better than my two-handers or my two single-handers. The Thorn Collar Claw I have one of, but it does not have a cantrip on it.
Okay.
Maybe eventually I will get an Immortal Blaze of heroic level. But on my side, I've been mostly playing Cyberpunk, going through that again. It's still it's weird. Even with the changes, I'm enjoying the game, but the game has this weird binary difficulty, and maybe it's just the build I went, which is kind of I really like handguns as like a style, right? So I'm maxed out on cool, and the top level talent there is kind of headshots do absurd amounts of damage, and I had to crank the difficulty up to have a challenge, but it's one of those things where it's I will if I'm on, I will wipe and counter super easily, but if I miss my rhythm by a little bit, I will just go down in a hit, which is kind of hilarious. But still having fun with it. I don't think it's a particularly balanced game, but I am enjoying it. I'm enjoying the scenery. I think the game it feels like Skyrim to me in a way, in that game's not exactly the toughest thing in the world, and a lot of it relies and sometimes you stand outside the room and you shoot the thing in the head 10,000 times because its pathing can't get you out to the door. It's not quite that bad, but it gets into that realm. And then on the other hand, I'm playing a lot of Street Fighter. I literally today I hit platinum 4, which
congratulations
made me happy. Yeah. Which is interesting because I got a week ago, or no, 2 or 3 weeks ago, I got one fight away from it, and I just went on mega tilt and just kept losing LP, and I ended up actually at plat 2 for a minute, and then over the course of a couple days, and then it's wait, I just need to calm down and play a little bit more defensively and think a little bit more about what I'm doing, and I climbed right back up, and like I said, I just crested into plat 4, and hopefully I can keep it up there. But I've been thinking about trying Tekken 8, but it's one of those things where it's if I put time into Tekken 8, which is an absurd Tekken games are kind of absurd, that am I gonna, I don't know if I can play both Tekken and Street Fighter at the same time and not lose my mind. And then I just dabble in other stuff as things go along. I haven't really picked up any of the other games in a hot minute, but I've been thinking about Commander / EDH for a while, just because I guess just under 2 months, maybe 6-ish weeks, we're gonna be at PAX East. I get to play some Commander. I've been following this channel. It's called I'm going to go find it right now. It's called Salubrious Snail or something like that. I'll put a link in the description. Yes, Salubrious Snail. I got that right. And he talks a lot about EDH. And one of the things he talks about that I think is interesting is like your commander, like pointing your commander deck to be the appropriate power level because it is a casual format. And we have gotten to the point where commander is such a popular format that there are powerful, hard hitting, like winning decks. And like this is the thing about Magic in general that's kind of
Yeah.
interesting to talk about, but I think it's most at the forefront in Commander, which can you hear me?
I can hear you. Loot is telling me the broadcast died.
It says it reconnected. When did it die? How long ago did it die? Should be back. Anyway, we will, for the people who lost the thank you for calling that out. I just got a notification on my computer. For whatever you missed, it'll be in the podcast release.
True.
As one of the other podcast listeners to puts it, is like this is a podcast that has a Twitch live stream attached to it if you happen to make it. But yeah, so like just like as a format, Magic is, or as a format, Commander is supposed to be a more casual format, and so like building decks to each to like appropriate power levels is kind of important. He talks about this interestingly about how like Soul Ring is a super powerful card, but it is so common that it can be basically in every deck. But it kind of like it screws with the power level of kind of decks, kind of like how Counterspell, which is a easily available card or generally available card, but it's so much better than any of the other Counterspells because Counterspell was kind of a mistake. Kind of skews the power level of the format, right? Because like your second best Counterspell and your second best mana ramp are not going to be as good, but they're also probably going to be more expensive because they're rarer, right? So like everybody has a Soul Ring, but not everybody has like a Shockland, right? And those are the things you need to think about when building to like a group, right? Like I've been talking to you about this. I'm building an Azorius deck just designed to be kind of miserable to play against because I'm a terrible person. I will probably inflict that on you guys once at most, right? Like I am not going to like sit there and like play that all the time. And even like the AC the Guy or Tyrant deck that I run, right? Like I will probably play that once against your Ninjas deck, and then like move to a deck that is like I actually like I have my Chaos Space Marines deck, which is still stock, so I don't have to worry about like it's just same as it was out of the box. And then I'm going to build another deck that's supposed to be a little bit more mid-range power level, so that I don't just like cause misery at the commander table. Do you have any thoughts on this?
I have lots of thoughts about this, and we can honestly break it out into a whole podcast. But yeah, that's definitely true. This is part of why I like the Ninjas deck and the way built it. Yuriko is actually a super meta CEDH commander, right? But the way that I have built it is essentially as an aggro deck, which is very rare in commander. It's hard to make an aggro deck work. But with Yuriko's ability and the ability to run combat tricks, right? Which is just like a fun and interesting sort of like way to do it. You can actually build a pretty powerful like Yuriko engine, as we've seen, because my deck works the way that it does. That tends to slip under other decks, right? When I'm playing Yuriko, I'm not really thinking all that much about ramp. I'm thinking a lot about turning cards sideways, right? Getting my attacks in, getting Yuriko on the board, right? Flipping stuff from the top of the deck. And even if I'm flipping low level shit, I'm still blitzing the whole, I'm lowering the whole kind of threshold of the Soul Ring point is really interesting. A Soul Ring to me is like Flash in League of Legends, where yes, every champion takes Flash, every Commander deck should have Soul Ring, but Commander is a better game for Soul Ring, and League of Legends is a better game for Flash. So even though, yeah, they are just like so incredibly out there powerful, it matters. The reason why Soul Ring is interesting is because if you play it optimally, you are also playing suboptimally in a way, because the person who drops a Soul Ring on turn 1 paints the biggest target of all time onto their back. And that's a really interesting dynamic, I think, right? All of a sudden someone is the arch enemy because they're on their first untap, they're gonna have 4 mana, everybody else has 2. That's huge, right? And I just think that's really interesting. I think that makes for really like interesting kind of games, and that interesting dynamic is better than the balance of, because like the thing that people say about Soul Ring is like it's it's not the 99, it's the 98, because every deck is also going to have a Soul Ring in it, basically. So you're not actually making a decision on what to include in the 99 of your commander deck. But yeah, I don't know. I just think that's the way that the way that it works, at least from kind of like my perspective. I don't know. There's a part of me. I've been meaning to upgrade my Eureka deck for a while, because they put out a Kamigawa set that included some black blue ninjas, so I could swap some cards out of the Eureka deck and just change its kind of momentum in a different sort of way. Add some more ninjas in there. I have so many stupid fucking ninjas in that deck. I love that deck so much. And I think maybe I could be convinced to actually kind of like go through and do that. I also have a couple of other cards that I've been like meaning to get, but there's a big part of me that wants to just like make a new commander. There must be so many new commanders that have come out since then, that I'm like, oh, I could actually do something interesting here, right?
Yeah.
If I were to, I don't know,
Yeah,
dig
no,
deep.
there's like the way I've been doing it is like there's a theme that I have in mind. Like, so this mid range deck that or not mid range as a style, but like mid power deck that I'm building is
Sure.
built on this stupid thing I like to do, which is like it's a red black theme that I call Cap and Sack, which is you use red's kind of like temporary control, and you pull
Yeah,
a
and then you
creature's sack.
oh my god,
Yeah.
that's brutal.
Yeah. But it's like, it requires pieces, right? It's not super reliable. But the only commander with that effect, or there's two, and one's the Beast, I think, from Doctor Two, and the other's Sauron from Lord of the Rings. And there's not particularly like repeatable either. They're just kind of like
Mhm.
enter the battlefield effects, and like there's no flicker effects in black or red, right?
Yeah.
So it's just like, I might make the commander a sacrifice based commander. Instead, and just like use them on the side, like this is Zorius deck here. I've got it sitting right next to me. I have 6 potential commanders. Yeah, I've got Grand Arbiter Augustin. I've got, who's that? I've got Azor. I've got, what is this, Elminster. I've got
Yes.
Rafa Hazid, which is probably not.
Oh my god, Guafa Hazid is such a dumb card, but I love it. What a great inclusion.
Dathos of Miletus, which is like one that like is like a can't be attacked by big things, and then Lavinia of 10th, right? These are all like the legendary cards that ended up putting in this stupid fucking deck, but like that's because Azorius is like a pretty strong theme, right? Like Cabin Stack is not a strong theme, so there's not a lot of commander support for it. But there is, there are things that like will work off the sacrifice engine or whatnot.
I feel like I should make a bunch of decks. I feel like I should make a samurai deck at some point, even though samurai are historically absolutely garbage.
Oh, so
I feel like there's just got to be fun shit to do with samurai.
As I have been looking, as I was looking through like the these Cabin Stack effects, there's like a pretty strong. There's like if I did blue, red, black, there's a pirate commander, and there's a bunch of pirates in there. There's also some like Cabin Stack.
Oh, I know that pirate deck. Yeah.
There's like some vampires that like work on the sack side, and I kind of want to make at some point a like the Warhammer 3 faction, like a vampire pirates deck. But this is also one of those things where like the more you start to put these things together, you realize that like 100 cards really isn't that many cards, right? And you're never gonna get all of the dumb stuff that you want in a deck. So, is this how you fix Commander and make it like less competitive brain? It's like now the decks are 200 cards. But yeah,
I guess so. Okay.
Yeah.
What else has been going on? Have you watched more Sopranos since we last talked?
I don't think since we last talked. Instead, I have watched the first 6 episodes or so of the Clone Wars, the Dave Filoni Clone Wars, which is, as far as I know, the only thing besides the movies that are canon in both the Legends and the canon timeline at this point. Which is interesting because like I knew there was something up with the canon. And I was like, asking. My girlfriend is very into the Clone Wars. She's very into the Bad Batch. She's like, "What's the canonness?" And she's like, "It's canon as far as I know." I looked it up, and I looked it up. It's like everything but season 7 is canon in Legends, as well as being canon in the new canon. Which is interesting. Apparently, Disney Plus has the episodes in like a different order than they were released in. It's interesting watching the show because like apparently it's all anthology stuff, right? Like I guess they expect you to come in with like knowledge of who all these characters are, because like characters that I'm just not familiar with, like Ventress, right? Will just like be like, and here's Ventress. It's like who? And it's like she's the bad guy, right? Like and like obviously I get like I know who Obi-Wan and Anakin are, but the first time they appear on screen, there's no like, and I'm Anakin, the hero of, like the hero of the clone, it just kind of like expects you to know it. I will also say that like I have been, I have heard a lot of good things, and maybe I'm a little bit like underwhelmed by anticipation. Maybe that's because the earlier episodes, and also I think ultimately it is a kid's show, and it's got a relatively short running time, and so like, like there's an episode early on where I think it's called Delta Squad. Essentially, a batch of clone troopers like fail their test, and they're given one opportunity to retake it. And like in like most shows, there'd be like at least a montage of them training. And no, it's just like they get an inspiring speech. Like a couple of them get like inspiring speeches, and that like makes them good at being clone troopers, right? Which is kind of like I noticed that, but I'm not convinced that like what would it be like? Like 12-year-old me, which is I think what the target audience would have noticed that. So maybe it's fine. I don't know. Do you have strong thoughts on the Clone Wars?
I like the Clone Wars quite a lot as a sort of setting. Is that what you're talking about?
I'm talking about the Clone Wars, the Dave Filoni show.
Okay. I have seen some of the Clone Wars, the Dave Filoni show, but not all of it. I think I watched into season like 3 or whatever. Eventually, it starts creating a bunch of characters that it will go on to reference, sort of down the line, basically.
Right, because the Bad Batch is basically a Clone Wars spin-off show, as far as I know.
Yeah. And there's like a bunch of like, do you know the character? There's like a bounty hunter. He's like a frog guy, and he has these like tubes coming out of in a big wide brimmed hat. He's like in stuff, but like that's like a Clone Wars character. I'm sorry, what?
Does he have a triangle head? Is it Ellis?
No, God, I can't remember. What is that bounty hunter's name?
It's like L-less. He's one of the guys who trains the clones along with like Brick.
God, what the fuck is this guy's name? He's like, he just shows up so much. Oh, fuck. I found, okay. Show me, what's the website? Cad Bane.
Oh, Cad Bane?
Yeah.
Isn't Cad Bane like a famous like? I've heard that name.
He's from the Clone Wars. I'm pretty sure. Really? I think that's where he came from.
Oh, interesting. Okay. I see. I wouldn't have called him a frog guy, but I get what you're saying. Yeah. He's a Duros. But yeah. I have not seen Cad Bane in the Clone Wars yet, but like I'm still relatively
early. So like Cad Bane, I think is like a good example. The thing I like about the Clone Wars is it just lets you do like pretty simple like World War II serials kind of like stuff. There's a couple of like early Clone Wars episodes that are just like really straightforward and fun. That it's like, there's one where I think it's Plo Koon and he's in space. And there's like a bunch of, it's like a new Jedi or something, and like a bunch of droids, like like fighting like a bunch of battle droids, and it's just like it's a simple story of two soldiers in a dangerous situation. They're surrounded by enemies, and they make a clever decision to get out of it. This is like perfect for Clone Wars. This is like my platonic ideal of like a Clone Wars episode. There's an episode it's just about like the siege of this one city in the Outer Rim, and Mace Windu and maybe Obi-Wan is there or something. And it's just like, it just tells the story of this battle, this siege, kind of from beginning to end. And that's just like, I don't know. There's just something really kind of like perfect about the sort of setup and the vision for this. And it's the opposite of The Last Jedi. You know how everybody says for The Last Jedi, it doesn't feel like Star Wars. I don't make that contention, but I know that a lot of people do.
I make that
Clone Wars. Yeah, exactly. Clone Wars feels like Star
like,
Wars.
yes.
It is it feels more like Star Wars than some of the movies, right? Than like some of the original trilogy, I would probably say. And it's just like that is good. That is like I don't know. It's just it's good. It is a little bit of a kids show for me though. And I was able to kind of like get all the way through to the other side. Even if it probably, competes with like Avatar The Last Airbender or something like as just like a neat, interesting kids show that is, serialized in that kind of way.
I will say that like I am not a huge fan of the art style either. Like Jar Jar and Count Dooku in particular look wacky to me. Um, but
I mean, yeah, Dooku is interesting because he's based off of the Gendy Tarkovsky design from the Clone Wars animated thing that he did.
Clone Wars is what that's here. I looked this
Correct.
Up.
Yeah,
it's Clone Wars and the Clone Wars, which is
yeah, and Clone Wars is I think the best Star Wars thing. Like just like it is so Star Wars, which is what I love about it. Anyway, so yeah.
Yeah. Otherwise, I just been chilling. Nothing. My YouTube content is a lot of woodworking stuff these days.
Oh my god, your plaid shirt. Where's the Hawaiian shirt, Mango? I'm watching you. You're changing. Different person. I don't even know you anymore.
Part of that's just the winter, but I feel
sure.
that. What about you? Have you been up to anything else?
I have been playing a little bit of Grime. I've been playing a lot of Satisfactory. We ended up making a big multiplayer server for Satisfactory, and I am just so hyper about this game and the numbers. It is so much more draining than I think it is or should be. In like a true sense. It just like takes more of my sort of like time and attention to like do it, but there's just like something so satisfying about going, okay, we have a shortage of X, we need to make more X. How are we going to do that? And I sit down and I do the math and I go, okay, so this node of iron is bringing in, 240 iron ore per minute. That every smelter can smelt 30 iron ore per minute, which means I need 8 smelters, and it's going to create 240 iron ingots. And some of those ingots are going to go to rods, and some of those ingots are going to go to plates. And then we're going to combine the rods and the plates at this rate and that thing. And it's just like all that stuff I just find like really fun, really compelling. And the ability to organize a factory kind of not just horizontally like in Factorio, but vertically up and down is really useful, right? I have these huge stacks of conveyor belts that are all on top of each other, bringing in huge lines of one product here or there kind of thing, and just all of that is, I don't know, it's really fun, it's really good, I'm having a good time with it. So I guess that's the real answer. I've also been playing some Grime. I have decided now that Grime the definitive edition is out, I am going to definitively edition the game. I'm going to definitively go in, beat the game, do all the bosses. I so far cannot fucking find the vulture. I know the next boss is supposed to be the vulture. I know I'm right there, but I just can't fucking find where he is in order to progress to the next area. I also have been using the Carven Greatsword because I'm doing a strength build, because strength builds are more fun in that stupid game. And I can't remember where the jaw axe is. I want to get the jaw axe because I know that it's around here somewhere, but I can't remember where specifically it is. And so I've just like been looking for the jaw. It's just like I'm trying to do all of this stuff without without any kind of bullshit. I think right now I'm using the Carven Greatsword and the Pillar Slab, which is another strength scaling weapon that is really dumb. And and yeah, but I was actually surprised how quickly I was able to beat some of these bosses. It took me so many tries, it feels like, to beat some of the first bosses in the game. But now, like when I first played the game, but now I guess I'm just fucking better or something. Who knows?
I find that to be the case with a lot of Souls likes. I'm sure we'll talk about this when we talk about Souls Likification, but a lot of it is just kind of like learning the game, and then your second pass through it is a lot quicker than your first pass.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm like, I don't know. I might go back and try that at some point. I just haven't had the time because
Yeah.
so many games, so much content to consume, buddy.
So much content to consume. I agree.
Uh,
Okay, well,
when
I
does
guess that's
Madam
that.
Web come out?
Oh my god, I have no idea.
We have to deal with that maybe. So the Nerd Crew, Red Letter Media did their a Nerd Crew thing for Madam Web. They saw that tickets went on sale. It's in like 3 weeks or something. February. Oh, it comes out on Valentine's Day. Is that
Oh
when you're
my
going
god.
to take your
I
your
fucking
spouse?
guess. No, no way. But yeah, we can definitely do Valentine's Day, I guess.
Man,
We can definitely do Valentine's Day.
Madam
Madam
Web.
Web.
I might. So I have that Monday off for President's Day, so maybe I'll go see it on President's Day. That's how I want to spend my President's Day with Madam Web. Yeah. So,
Okay.
anyway, I think that's everything that I had, buddy. You have anything else you want to talk about?
Do I have anything else I want to talk about? Oh, no.
All right. If you'd like to email us about any of the things we talked about on this podcast, you can email us at derpsplaygames@gmail.com or podcast@derpsplaygames.com. You can follow us at twitch.tv/derpsplaygames or youtube.com/derpsplaygames. Rate reviews wherever there are podcasts. Links will be down in the description. Bud, do you have anything else you're looking to promote?
I have one thing that I'm looking to promote this week. It's Steam Next Fest, and I have a game in Steam Next Fest. It is Cryptmaster. I have been talking about Cryptmaster for a while. It's getting closer and closer to release. The demo is up, so if you haven't played the Cryptmaster demo, play that. But also, we are doing a D&D stream for Cryptmaster this Thursday, 10 a.m. Pacific, where Lee, one of the developers on the game who voices the Cryptmaster, is going to run a game of D&D for a couple of us who are going to be playing the characters in Cryptmaster, and I just think it's going to be wild. It's going to be a lot of fun. That's Thursday at 10 a.m.
Oh, I just opened the Steam page, and who's in the lower right-hand corner now broadcasting?
God.
But my
Is it
good
me?
friend. But how are you both places at once?
Good question. Listen, the world may never know, buddy.
All right. Well, with that, I'm going to say until next time, dear listeners.
Until next time, loyal listeners.